Ever get the feeling that, like, there are all these, like, hidden lessons, right? Like, just beneath the surface of, like, what we see happening in society.
Yeah, yeah.
Like, if you really look closely at how things unfold, especially when it comes to, you know, institutions and people in positions of power,
Yeah,
there are some pretty profound lessons we can learn.
I think you're right.
So let's unpack this,
Oh,
because
good.
that is exactly what we are doing today.
That's great. That's great. I think what's fascinating and what I always find interesting is that the most valuable public learning doesn't come from some abstract theory,
Right.
but actually comes from observing real-world situations.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
And it's about the decisions that people made, the processes they followed,
Right.
and just like the consequences that ripple outward from all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this deep dive is a prime example of that.
Okay, great.
Because we've gone out and we've compiled a range of sources, legal documents, transcripts from court, detailed reports, all centered around a long-running situation.
Yeah.
And this was the wrongful dismissal of officers from RBC Royal Bank of Trinidad and Tobago.
Wow. That sounds like there's a lot to unpack there.
There is. So, I mean, it's interesting, right? Because if you think about it, like, from the perspective of the listener, think about this as like an opportunity to
That's right.
become like a forensic observer
Okay, yeah.
of a very particular set of events.
Yeah, okay.
Our mission here today is not just to tell you what happened,
Mm-hmm.
but to really dissect it
Yeah, I like it.
and really extract the broader insights
Okay.
about how systems work,
Uh-huh.
how individuals behave within those systems,
Right.
and then ultimately,
Yeah.
what can you learn from all of this?
Yeah, I think that's the big question, right?
It is.
What can we learn from this?
Yeah. So we really want to go beyond the headlines and, pull out those key takeaways.
Wait, the aha moments.
The aha moments that can sharpen your understanding of how society functions.
Yes.
So let's get into it.
Okay.
Where did this all begin?
So the core issue started with the dismissal of these RBC Royal Bank officers. And this was back in 2014.
Okay.
And the State Police Association, the EPA,
Right.
they stepped in to represent them.
Yeah.
And initiated legal action on their behalf.
Okay. So right away, we see a critical moment here.
Okay.
So the EPA registered the case with the Ministry of Labor,
Uh-huh.
but they made a really fundamental error in how they actually classified the dismissal.
Oh, interesting. So what did they do?
So instead of registering it as wrongful dismissal due to redundancy,
Great.
they just simply labeled it as dismissal.
Okay.
Now, this might seem like a minor detail,
Right.
but the sources make it very clear
Mm-hmm.
that this initial misstep had huge legal ramifications for the officers involved.
Wow.
It immediately weakened their position.
And so I guess the big takeaway here is that even seemingly like small bureaucratic errors
Right.
can have significant legal consequences
Absolutely.
for everyday people.
Absolutely. And not only that, it kind of set the stage for a lot of the issues that followed.
Right.
Because it put the officers in a very difficult position right from the start.
Mm-hmm.
So a seemingly small administrative detail had a huge impact.
Okay.
So now let's move on to the various players that were involved
Okay.
and what the sources reveal about their actions,
Oh,
because
okay.
this is where we start to see some really interesting patterns emerge.
Okay. So let's begin with the State Police Association itself.
Okay.
Beyond that initial classification error, what else did the sources uncover about their role in all of this?
Well, later in the process, there are all these allegations
Mhm.
of a divide and rule strategy being employed, supposedly by the president of the EPA.
Wow, so they're kind of turning against the people they're supposed to be representing?
It certainly appears that way based on the information that we have.
Wow.
Yeah. So we hear about these two officers, Victor Sandy and Clayton Nurse, trying to arrange a meeting with the president,
Yeah.
and they're turned down,
Mm.
flat out.
Wow.
And instead, they're offered this alternative approach that avoids direct discussion,
Uh-huh.
which they declined.
Okay.
So what's fascinating here, and something I think for you, the listener, to think about is like
Right.
that offering an alternative, right?
Uh-huh.
That bypasses direct engagement
Yeah.
can often be a tactic
Yes.
to try to control a situation or potentially avoid scrutiny.
Why? Accountability.
Exactly. And we see this pattern in various settings, not just in a legal context.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I've seen that so many times.
Yeah. And it got even more specific.
Okay.
So these officers were told
Yeah.
that to even be considered for their own legal representation,
Uh-huh.
they would need to gather more signatures from other officers than the president already had.
Oh, wow. So it's like they're setting up an impossible barrier.
It sounds less like support and more like creating a hurdle.
Yeah.
And then we also learned that the EPA initially expressed a desire to actually withdraw from the whole matter altogether due to the potential legal costs.
Oh, wow.
So already you're seeing a bit of a troubling picture emerging here.
Yeah, absolutely. So they're kind of setting up these roadblocks, and then they want to bail on them because of the cost.
Yeah, and this is all happening before the case even really gets going.
Wow.
Right.
That's awful.
It's pretty bad.
Okay, so let's move on to another individual.
Okay.
A guy named Harrison Thompson.
Okay.
He was the industrial relations officer, and he seems to have played a very, very central and controversial role in all of this.
Absolutely.
What really stood out to you about him?
So Harrison Thompson, I mean, this guy is really at the heart of a lot of the alleged wrongdoing that happened.
Okay.
The sources paint a very troubling picture of his actions.
Okay, like what? Give me an example.
Well, the alleged misrepresentation of legal information during hearings. This is someone in a position of expertise, right? Right. He should know better.
Yeah, he should. Providing what seems to be just totally incorrect information.
Wow.
And then there are claims of false information in affidavits, including getting the hearing dates wrong.
Wow.
So, for you listening,
Yeah.
this highlights the importance of verifying information.
Yes.
Especially when it comes from people in positions of authority.
Absolutely, because they're supposed to be trustworthy, right?
Exactly.
They're supposed to guide us.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so at the heart of it, there's this issue with case numbers.
Right.
Can you talk about that a little bit more?
So Thompson allegedly led the officers to believe that their original case, which was known as ST-0615, was continuing.
Right.
When in fact he had secretly initiated a whole new case, ST-2217.
Wow.
And the sources emphasized that this was presented as like a seamless continuation.
Right. Masking the fact that it was an entirely new legal action with potentially very different implications and timelines.
So he was deliberately misleading them?
It certainly seems that way.
Wow.
And this raises a really serious question about the ethical responsibility of individuals who act in a representative capacity.
Yeah.
If these allegations are accurate, it suggests a very deliberate attempt to mislead these officers about the nature of their own legal fight.
And this is a classic example of why you need transparency and honesty, especially in roles like that.
100%. Now let's bring in another individual, Robert Ramotar, who was the EPA liaison. And he seemed to play a key role in maintaining the officers' trust in Harrison Thompson.
Wait, so he was telling these officers to trust the guy who was misleading them?
That's what it looks like.
That's terrible.
So the sources suggest that he was instrumental in persuading them to trust Thompson, despite all of the red flags that were already there. There's also this implication that Ramotar may have withheld critical information, which further contributed to this illusion of a unified and properly managed legal effort.
Wow.
This whole thing underscores how important it is to have those independent channels of information, right?
Yes.
And to question assurances, especially when you're dealing with complex situations like this.
Yeah, absolutely.
He was essentially acting as a go-between for the EPA, Thompson, and the officers.
Right.
And there are these strong suggestions that he wasn't being fully transparent in his communications.
Wow.
And given his actions, there's actually a demand now for him to be included as a named respondent in future legal proceedings.
Okay.
So they're seeking accountability for his alleged misconduct and potential mishandling of funds.
Wow, so they're not letting him off the hook.
No, they're not.
So there's this demand for accountability.
Right.
That's woven through all of this.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's turn our attention to Clay Hackett.
Okay.
What was his involvement in all of this?
So Clay Hackett is alleged to have actually misinterpreted the verbatim notes from the hearings in a way that favored the special tribunal rather than the officers.
Okay.
And critically, it's also reported that he relied on incorrect information provided by, you guessed it, Harrison Thompson.
Oh, wow. So he was basing his interpretations on bad information.
Right.
That's a problem.
And this really shows how misinformation can compound itself.
Yes, absolutely.
Influence understanding at multiple levels.
Yeah, so it's a ripple effect, right?
It is.
One person gets bad information and it just spreads from there.
Exactly.
Wow.
And then this brings us to the special tribunal itself,
Okay.
which was chaired by Lawrence Akong.
Uh-huh.
And this institution comes under really serious scrutiny in the sources that we've examined.
Yeah, their actions seem to be at the center of a lot of this controversy.
Right. So let's start with their initial dismissal of the case. So the sources highlight that the tribunal just dismissed the case without providing adequate reasoning.
Mm-hmm.
This lack of transparency right from the start made it very difficult for anyone to understand the basis of their decision.
Yeah.
I mean, the lesson here is that clear and well-reasoned justifications are absolutely crucial.
Right.
For maintaining public trust.
Of course.
In these kinds of judicial bodies.
Yeah, otherwise, how can you trust the system if you don't understand how they're making decisions?
Exactly.
Right.
And what's particularly striking is what happened during the appeal to the Privy Council, which is, of course, the highest court.
Right.
So the tribunal is actually accused of inventing an entirely new legal argument.
What?
Specifically for the Privy Council.
That seems pretty shady.
It does. And the argument is referred to as the branch board issue.
Okay.
And the sources emphasize that this argument was never brought up or used in the original hearings or even in the Court of Appeal.
So they're just making stuff up as they go along.
It appears that way.
Wow.
And this is a huge red flag, I think, for anyone listening.
Yeah.
When you start introducing entirely new arguments at the highest level, it suggests a potential attempt to justify earlier decisions that were maybe not on solid ground.
Yeah, and I mean, that's incredibly misleading.
Absolutely, and the issues with transparency didn't end there.
Oh, okay, what else happened?
The tribunal also withheld the verbatim notes from those hearings for a really long time.
Oh, wow, so they're not even letting people see what was actually said.
Right, exactly.
What was going on in the room.
Yeah, so they withheld these notes, and this directly impacted the officer's ability to actually scrutinize what had happened in the hearings.
Right.
To identify inconsistencies or misrepresentations.
Right.
And to really fully grasp those discrepancies between the two alleged cases.
Yeah.
This underscores the vital role of access to information in ensuring accountability.
Absolutely. Transparency is key.
Right. If you can't see the evidence, how can you challenge anything?
Exactly. It's like they're trying to operate in the dark.
Exactly. And the sources characterize this withholding of information as a key part of obscuring the true sequence of events. And maybe the most significant criticism came directly from the Privy Council about the tribunal's overall conduct.
Okay.
So the Privy Council strongly criticized the special tribunal for adopting this very adversarial stance throughout these entire legal proceedings.
Right.
Instead of acting as an impartial judicial body.
Yeah, which is what they're supposed to do.
Exactly.
Get neutral.
They essentially behaved as if they were a litigant with a vested interest in the outcome of the case.
So they were basically acting like one of the sides involved.
Right. They were taking sides.
What?
And the Privy Council pointed out that this is a really clear breach of their fundamental duties.
Yeah, absolutely.
As a judicial body.
Yeah, you can't be a judge and a player at the same time.
Exactly.
It doesn't work like that.
Right.
You can't be impartial if you're rooting for one side.
No, you can't. And they even noted that the tribunal appeared to be acting on behalf of a third party without even informing that party that they were doing so.
What?
Yeah.
That's wild.
That's a really extraordinary accusation for a judicial body to face.
Yeah, it's like they were working in secret with someone.
It certainly seems that way. And as a direct consequence of all of this, the Privy Council issued a very clear directive.
Okay.
They ruled that no member of the original panel, including Chairman Akong, should be involved in this matter in any future proceedings.
So they're basically saying, you're out.
Essentially.
Wow.
Which brings us to a rather peculiar problem.
Okay.
So the legislation that governs the special tribunal doesn't include a provision for a vice chair.
Oh, so there's no backup.
There's no backup.
Wow.
So they cannot legally function without their chairman.
Yeah.
But the highest court has explicitly barred him from participating.
So they're in a deadlock.
Deadlock. This legal oversight has brought the tribunal's ability to act to a standstill.
Yeah, because they can't proceed with the chairman, but they can't proceed without him either.
Right. Exactly. And this situation really highlights how crucial it is to have really robust, well-thought-out institutional frameworks,
Right.
including contingency plans.
Yeah, they need a backup plan for situations like this.
Exactly, because things can go wrong.
Absolutely.
Right.
Yeah.
And you need to be prepared for those situations.
Right.
And there were also arguments raised by the special tribunal about whether it was actually a superior court of record.
Okay.
And this was a status they seemed eager to assert.
Okay, so what happened with that?
So both the Court of Appeal
Yep.
and ultimately the Privy Council rejected this argument. They confirmed that the special tribunal is indeed subject to judicial review
Okay.
by the High Court.
Right.
This really reinforces the principle of checks and balances within our legal system.
Absolutely, because nobody is above the law.
Exactly. So let's shift our focus now to the role that the Attorney General's office played in all of this.
Okay.
Their involvement also faces a lot of scrutiny in the sources.
Okay, what were some of the main criticisms?
So one really significant point is that the AG's office allowed the special tribunal to appeal to the Privy Council,
Yeah.
even though the tribunal's original reasoning for their decision was later found to be flawed.
Okay.
So this allowed what the Privy Council considered a legally baseless appeal
Wow.
to proceed all the way to the highest court.
And that wasted a lot of time and money.
Exactly. And it raises questions about how thoroughly these things are reviewed at each stage.
Right, and if public resources are being used efficiently.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And this decision by the AG effectively prolonged the legal uncertainty for those officers.
Right.
And then additionally, there are these concerns raised about the lack of financial transparency.
Regarding the legal expenditures.
Yeah, the legal expenditures associated with the case. And of course, this raises questions about responsible use of taxpayer funds.
Yeah, because that's our money that they're spending.
Exactly. And it's a reminder of the importance of really open and accountable governance.
Absolutely. We need to know where our money is going and why.
100%. And then the AG's office also reportedly defended the EPA's actions.
Okay.
And some sources suggest that this may have overlooked the inconsistencies between the initial mishandled case and the subsequent new case.
Right, so they're kind of turning a blind eye to some of the problems.
Yeah, it seems like it. And this defense potentially contributed to the fact that these legal battles just dragged on for so long.
Wow.
And then a key point of criticism is the alleged failure of the AG's office to act during the almost 2-year delay in the appeal process by the special tribunal.
Right.
And this period of inaction is really seen as enabling the injustice and causing unnecessary hardship for the officers involved.
Right, so it's like they had the power to step in and do something, but they chose not to.
Exactly.
Wow.
And this really underscores the importance of timely and effective oversight within these government institutions.
Yeah, you need people watching the watchers, right?
Absolutely.
Making sure they're doing their jobs.
So this brings us to the really crucial issue of procedural failures.
Yeah.
And the really wide-ranging impact they had in this situation.
Yeah, it's clear that how things are processed and the timeliness involved have huge consequences.
Absolutely. The delayed appeal, the withholding of those essential documents, like a verbatim notes, the initial misclassification by the EPA, these weren't just minor administrative issues.
No, they had real consequences for the officers involved.
They had tangible and very damaging consequences. So they were left in a state of limbo for years, facing just immense uncertainty about their futures.
Right.
And the very real possibility of losing their right to compensation due to what are known as statutory limitations.
Okay, and can you explain what that means?
Yeah, so for you listening, that means there's a legal time limit to file a claim.
Right.
And these kinds of delays can really jeopardize your rights.
Wow.
They also incurred really significant and likely unnecessary legal fees fighting what the Privy Council determined to be an appeal. Lacking legal merit.
Right, so they spent all this money for nothing.
Exactly. Yeah. And beyond the financial strain, the emotional and psychological toll of that prolonged uncertainty cannot be overstated.
Absolutely. It's incredibly stressful to be in that kind of limbo.
It is. This case is a powerful example of how these procedural flaws can undermine the very essence of justice.
Yeah. So it's not just about getting the right outcome in the end. It's about having a fair process along the way.
Absolutely. And the Privy Council's finding that the special tribunal's appeal lacked legal merit really underscores the impact of the AG's inaction
Right.
in allowing this baseless appeal to go on for so long.
Yeah.
And there are even allegations that the special tribunal deliberately delayed the appeal,
Yeah.
possibly as a tactic to push the case closer to that statutory limitation deadline.
Oh, so they were trying to run out the clock.
It seems that way.
Wow, that's terrible.
So let's talk about the Privy Council's judgment itself
Okay.
and the significant implications that it has.
Okay.
So the Privy Council's judgment
Mm-hmm.
was a very clear and decisive victory
Yeah.
for the Estate Police Association
Uh-huh.
and those dismissed officers.
Right.
But the significance goes beyond just the outcome.
Okay.
The judgment contains some very strong criticisms as well.
Okay, so what did they say?
So the Privy Council didn't just rule in favor of the EPA. They delivered a sharp rebuke of the special tribunal's conduct,
Okay.
and they specifically called them out
Mhm.
for adopting that adversarial stance that we talked about.
Right, where they were acting like they were one of the parties.
Exactly.
Right.
For failing to uphold their fundamental statutory duties
Mm-hmm.
and for acting with a vested interest on behalf of a third party
Right.
without even informing them.
And that's a big no-no for a judicial body.
Huge no-no. This highlights how important those higher courts are
Yeah?
in ensuring accountability within the judicial system.
Absolutely.
They're there to make sure that the lower courts are playing by the rules.
Right, and that justice is being served.
Exactly. And the Privy Council's directive
Uh-huh.
that no one involved in the original denial of representation
Mm-hmm.
or the decision to refer the matter to the tribunal should be involved in any future proceedings
Right.
is incredibly significant.
Yeah, because it basically means a Kong is out of the picture. And that brings us back to that legislative gap.
Exactly. That
Yeah.
lack of a provision for a vice chair
Yeah.
to step in.
Right.
This oversight has created the current impasse,
Uh-huh.
right? The tribunal can't move forward without Mr. Akam,
Right.
but he's barred from participating.
Wow.
So this really underscores the importance of anticipating these kinds of potential issues
Yeah,
and making sure that our legal frameworks are truly comprehensive.
absolutely. You have to think ahead and plan for these things.
You do. Unsurprisingly, the EPA has now called for the removal of Mr. Akong as chairman.
Okay.
They view this as the necessary step to break this deadlock.
Yeah, they need a fresh start.
Exactly. And to finally allow the case to move forward fairly.
Yeah.
So let's not forget about the financial ramifications of this whole saga.
Right.
Because the sources point to some really potentially staggering figures
Okay.
in terms of wasted public funds.
So how much are we talking about?
So the estimated financial losses resulting from errors at every single stage of the judicial process, from the industrial court, the high court, the appeal court, and finally the Privy Council, could be tens of millions of dollars.
Oh, tens of millions.
Tens of millions.
Tens of millions.
It's a lot of money.
It's a lot of money. And it's a stark reminder of just how costly
Yeah.
these procedural failures and alleged misconduct within the system can actually be.
Yeah, and it's not just the initial costs.
No.
It's the wasted taxpayer money on these unnecessary appeals
Absolutely.
and the legal fees that the officers had to pay to fight those appeals.
Exactly. And so there's a very clear demand in the sources for accountability
Right.
from all the officials who allowed this to escalate
Mm-hmm.
and who approved these unsuccessful appeals.
Yeah. Someone needs to be held responsible for this mess.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a good reminder that we need to demand transparency
100%.
in how our money is being spent, especially when it comes to legal proceedings like this. Yeah, because ultimately, this is all about public trust and ensuring that our institutions are functioning properly.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
We've talked about the origins of this issue,
Mhm.
the roles of the key players,
Right.
the procedural missteps,
Uh-huh.
the Privy Council's judgment,
Yeah.
and the financial implications.
Right.
So now I think it's time to talk about the bigger picture.
Okay.
What can we learn from all of this?
Exactly. So by looking closely at these events
Mm-hmm.
and the behaviors that we've observed,
Right.
some really important and broadly applicable lessons emerge.
Yeah. Okay, so what are some of those key takeaways?
So let's start with the EPA's initial misclassification.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
That seemingly small mistake
Right.
really underscores how important accuracy and diligence are,
Uh-huh.
even in the most basic bureaucratic procedures.
Yeah, one little error can have huge consequences down the line. And it's a lesson that applies to all sorts of things, not just legal matters.
Absolutely. I mean, think about your own life, right?
Yeah.
Filing taxes, applying for permits,
Right.
anything that involves